All 4 police officers involved in the death of George Floyd are formally charged, but the state says it's only one small step towards justice.
What I do not believe is that one successful prosecution can rectify the hurt and loss that so many people feel.
What lies behind the prevalence of police brutality in the United States? We have a special report. Start in the US, where all 4 police officers who were present when George Floyd was arrested in the city of Minneapolis are now facing charges in connection with his death. Derek Chauvin, the officer who was filmed kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck, has had his charge elevated from 3rd degree to 2nd degree murder. Let's just have a look at what that means in the state of Minnesota. The law there defines 1st degree murder as one in which the defendant has the intention to kill and usually requires some element of premeditation. Well, 2nd degree murder, the charges being brought here, requires intention on the part of the defendant, but is more related to crimes of passion or crimes in the heat of the moment. And 3rd degree murder wouldn't require proof that the defendant wanted the victim to die, only that their actions were dangerous and carried out without regard to human life. Barbara Plett-Usher reports from Minneapolis.
For the past week, protesters have been demanding justice for George Floyd, tougher action against the police officers who arrested him. There's been frustration, sadness, and pain. But today, finally, some news.
The very fact that we have filed these charges means that we believe in them. But what I do not believe is that one successful prosecution can rectify the hurt and loss that so many people feel. The solution to that pain will be slow and difficult work of constructing justice and fairness in our society.
These are the 4 officers who arrested George Floyd. The one who pinned him to the ground with a knee to his neck while he struggled to breathe was charged, but not the others who are now formally accused of playing a role in his death. Today, the family returned to the memorial on the street corner where Mr. Floyd took his last breath. Speaking through their lawyer, they've been calling for the authorities to carry out a thorough investigation into the actions of the police force.
We cannot have 2 justice systems in America, one for Black America and one for white America. We must have equal justice for the United States of America.
Protests that began on the streets of Minneapolis spread across the country in demonstrations not seen since the civil rights unrest of the 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of people marched, defying curfews, clashing with the police, chanting, "I can't breathe," and "Black Lives Matter." The turmoil provoked a threat from the president to deploy the military, a scenario that so alarmed the defense secretary, today he publicly opposed it.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
The mother of George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter said he'd been a good father who provided for them.
He would never see her grow up, graduate. He would never walk her down the aisle.
The charges announced today may bring justice for Mr. Floyd, but they won't be enough to quell the demands for radical reform of the way America polices Black people. This feels different from previous protests against police brutality. It has galvanized more people across more divides than ever before, a movement against racial injustice that will not be easily silenced.
The Attorney General said that the justice system had failed to investigate and bring to justice these kinds of cases in Minnesota and across the country, which is an extraordinary statement. Now that the charges have been laid, people will be watching very carefully to see how the prosecution plays out, but also what happens on the street, whether cases of excessive police force against Black people continue and how they are handled. Barbara Plett-Usher, BBC News, Minneapolis.
Well, the former President Barack Obama has been speaking by video link at a virtual town hall on reimagining policing in the wake of continued police violence. He said this time the protest felt different.
I have to tell you, although I was very young when You had riots and protests and assassinations and discord back in the 60s. I know enough about that history to say there is something different here. You look at those protests, and that was a far more representative cross-section of America out on the streets, peacefully protesting, and who felt moved to do something because of the injustices that they had seen.
Barack Obama speaking in that virtual town hall meeting organised by his foundation. Well, George Floyd's name is the latest in a long list of black Americans to die as a result of police brutality over many decades. Clive Myrie looks at how a toxic mix of racism and bad policing has led to the most serious racial unrest in the US for many years. His report contains images you may find disturbing.
America's original sin perpetuates. The notion of the supremacy of whiteness over blackness as enshrined in slavery.
Where the Negroes have come up against determined white resistance, fighting has often broken out.
It helps underpin the brutality of some in the police. It helps underpin the poverty of the inner city. And it fundamentally underpins the racial inequality of a land where all are meant to be equal. I've been reporting from the United States for almost a quarter of a century.
Clive Myrie, BBC News, Los Angeles.
It's a generous nation. But for some, the original sin is still a rule to live by, as slavery morphed into segregation and Civil War battle flags became proud emblems of identity.
Hail, hail, state police! Hail, hail, state police!
Perhaps inevitably, the institution charged for centuries with enforcing discrimination is the one having the toughest time changing. Policing in America is opaque. There's little transparency. Powerful unions can protect bad cops, and the principle of qualified immunity means officers accused of misconduct are almost always given the benefit of the doubt.
I think that there are bad apples among many good police officers in most departments, but the fact that they don't get outed quickly and dismissed is a problem. The fact that a lot of these people who do get dismissed because of misconduct quickly find themselves recruited by other police departments in neighboring communities. They just go from one place to another.
It also doesn't help that America's policing system is fragmented to the point of farce, with around 18,000 different forces. In California, training can last 24 to 48 weeks, while in North Carolina, it's just 16 weeks, half the length of time it takes to become a licensed barber in the state. Whatever the training, the real-life fear of stopping a suspect who may be armed in a country awash with guns can lead to bad decisions.
Hey, you about to go to jail!
This is Atlanta in Georgia. It's after curfew during protests over the death of George Floyd. Police stop a car with 2 college students inside who protest they simply got stuck in traffic and didn't mean to break the curfew. The officers aren't convinced. The students are tasered. You can hear the tension and fear in the officer's voice. But the students are unarmed. 6 officers now face misconduct charges. Rogue cops, inadequate training and weak oversight are a toxic mix. Then add racism, a scourge in America that sleeps lightly when it sleeps at all. To wake, all it needs is the slightest provocation, as happened on a Minneapolis street one day in May. Clive Myrie, BBC News.